Henry VIII didn't just change the map of Europe, he rewrote the rules of reality just to avoid admitting he might have messed up. Let's be completely honest from the start. There is something deeply farcical about looking back at a man who fundamentally altered the geopolitical and religious landscape of Western Europe, simply because his ego couldn't handle the fact that he wasn't the flawless, omnipotent hero he imagined himself to be. We are talking about a bloke who, by the end of his days, was so massive he needed a mechanical hoist just to get onto his horse. Yet, in his own mind, he was still this remarkably slim, incredibly pure, terribly put upon Arthurian knight who just wanted everyone to follow the rules. Most of us feel a bit guilty when we eat the last biscuit in the tin, but Henry could chop off a couple of wives' heads, bankrupt the royal treasury, pull down monasteries that had stood for half a millennium, and then sit by the fire down at Whitehall sighing deeply about how terribly hard his life was. It takes a truly breathtaking level of self-delusion to split from Rome and declare yourself supreme head of the church just because you can't face the reality that you might just be a bit of an idiot, even if you brilliantly disguised it behind the desperate need for a male heir, a sudden craving for absolute political sovereignty, and a very convenient desire to pillage the church's massive wealth. In this video, we'll be exploring Henry's truly Olympic-level talent for playing the victim. We'll look at the masterful mental gymnastics he used to blame everyone else for his own train wrecks, whether he was mismanaging a marriage, executing a treacherous advisor, nursing a sore leg, or claiming God was personally ruining his week. He didn't start out as the monster, of course. That's the bit people forget. When his elder brother Arthur died in 1502, and you have to wonder what England would have looked like if Arthur, who was apparently a bit of a dreary, sickly lad, had actually lived to take the crown, young Henry was left in the clutches of Henry VII. Now, the old king was a notoriously miserable miser, and locked his son away in the palace like an expensive piece of porcelain. Henry VIII spent his teenage years being told he was the most important creature on earth, while simultaneously being forbidden from leaving his room without a guard, or talking to any girls who hadn't been thoroughly vetted by a committee of elderly bishops. It does things to a boy's head, that sort of upbringing. It breeds a very specific kind of internal pressure cooker. You become obsessed with your own virtue because you've never actually been allowed out into the mud to test it. He grew up believing he had to be absolutely flawless, not just good, perfect. He was taller than everyone else. He could speak 3 languages. He could play the lute rather beautifully. Though I've always found his famous tune, Pastime with Good Company, a bit repetitive if I'm being perfectly blunt. And he could outjoust half the professional soldiers in the kingdom. He was the golden boy, the Renaissance prince. So, when he finally gets the crown in 1509, after his dad finally drops dead and leaves him a vault, completely stuffed with gold coins, Henry doesn't just see himself as a king, he sees himself as God's own special little helper. The universe, in his eyes, is a giant vending machine designed to reward his obvious goodness with nothing but smooth sailing and beautiful things. But here is the snag. The universe is remarkably indifferent to Tudor self-esteem. The trouble with being raised to believe you are incapable of doing wrong is that when things inevitably go sideways, as they always do when you are trying to run a country in the 16th century, without any real understanding of economics, you can't blame yourself. That would break the spell. If something fails, it cannot be because Henry made a bad call. It must be a conspiracy. It must be that someone else has broken the rules of chivalry and treated him unfairly. You can see the beginnings of this weird, defensive psychological framework right at the start of his reign with the whole Catherine of Aragon business. She was his brother's widow, a highly political match. Henry, dynamic and 18, decides he is going to do the noble thing and marry her anyway, framing it to the world, and more importantly to himself, as this grand, selfless gesture of knightly protection. He was saving the poor Spanish princess from a life of limbo. He was being the perfect husband. Think about the sheer amount of energy it takes to maintain that level of delusion. It must be absolutely exhausting. Imagine waking up every morning and having to convince yourself that every single person you see in the hallway is secretly plotting to make you look bad. He had this small, round mouth, if you look at the Holbein portraits later on. His lips are tiny compared to the rest of his massive face, which always looks to me like he's about to throw a proper. Anyway, the early years were all tournaments and masks. Henry loved dressing up. He would turn up at court disguised as a Robin Hood character, bursting into his wife's chambers with a bunch of his mates, fully expecting everyone to be completely surprised and delighted by his brilliant acting skills. Catherine, who was far sharper than he ever gave her credit for, had to pretend to be utterly shocked every single time. Oh, goodness me, who is this giant red-headed man in green velvet? I have absolutely no idea. The illusion worked. He was the hero of the piece. The victimhood was still dormant, just waiting for the first real bit of friction to wake it up. And then the children started dying. That was where the cracks really began to show, right there in the nursery at Greenwich. Catherine gave birth to a boy in 1511, Prince Henry. The king went absolutely wild with joy. He fired off cannons, he held a massive tournament, he spent thousands of pounds on fireworks, and then, 52 days later, the little baby just stopped breathing. Just like that. No explanation, no modern medicine to tell them why. For an ordinary man like me, that is a private tragedy. For Henry, it was an existential insult. How could God let this happen to him? He had done everything right. He had been the pious king. He had fought the French. Well, he had paid a lot of money to watch other people fight the French while he sat in a tent, and he had kept his side of the bargain. It is around this point, I think, that the internal narrative shifts from, I am the luckiest boy alive, to, why is everyone trying to ruin my life? He looks at his wife, he looks at his empty cradle, and instead of feeling a shared human grief with Catherine, he starts to feel a strange, cold resentment. The marriage wasn't working the way it was supposed to. The vending machine had swallowed his coin and refused to drop the prize. It is a very short leap from that feeling to deciding that you are the one who has been cheated. So there he was, sitting in this chilly palace, looking at Catherine and probably wondering why on earth the universe was being so thoroughly ungenerous to him specifically. Because in his mind, you see, the whole setup was supposed to be a fairy tale where the heroic knight wins the prize and everyone lives happily ever after without any awkward complications. He'd taken her on when she was basically stranded in London after Arthur died, broke and miserable, writing frantic letters back to Spain asking for cash just to pay her servants. Henry stepped in like a grand, chivalrous saviour. He genuinely thought he was doing her the biggest favour in Christendom. It's funny how we look back at these royal marriages as cold business deals, which they were, obviously, but Henry was far too much of a romantic, or a massive hypocrite, depending on how generous you feel, to treat it like simple paperwork. He needed to be the hero of the story. He genuinely believed that God had personally looked down from heaven, nudged an angel and said, "Look at young Henry Tudor down there. What a splendid, selfless lad for marrying his dead brother's wife." Standard medieval protocol usually meant marrying some foreign princess for a hefty dowry and a few military outposts in northern France, but Henry turned this into an epic saga of duty and divine favour. Then the years start ticking by, 1513, 1514, 1516. Catherine keeps getting pregnant, which must have been utterly brutal on her body, to be frank. She has a stillborn girl, then that poor little boy who lasted under 2 months, then another miscarriage, then another baby who didn't survive the week. It's a relentless, heartbreaking conveyor belt of infant mortality. Mary survives, of course, born in 1516, a healthy enough little girl. But to Henry, a girl was practically a footnote, a consolation prize, a direct personal insult from the Almighty, if we're being entirely honest about how his mind worked. He couldn't just accept that infant survival in the 16th century was essentially a horrific lottery where even kings lost most of their tickets. No, there had to be a moral reason, a target on his back. She was 6 years older than him, which doesn't sound like much when you're 40, But when he was 25 and full of himself, and she was 31 and worn down by constant grieving pregnancies, the gap felt like a canyon. He didn't see a grieving mother who had lost child after child while trying to secure his own bloody dynasty. He saw a woman who was somehow failing to deliver her end of the bargain. He felt tricked. That's the word. Tricked. He began to convince himself that he'd been led into a trap by his father and the old councillors back in 1509. They'd pushed him into it, hadn't they? They'd told him it was his duty. He'd been such a good, obedient son, so noble and trusting, and now look what had happened. He was saddled with a wife who couldn't give him what every king needed, while all the other monarchs in Europe, like Francis I over in France, whom Henry absolutely loathed with every fibre of his being, were swaddled in healthy, bouncing baby boys. It made Henry look weak. It made him look unblessed. You could almost feel sorry for him if he weren't such a colossal nightmare to everyone around him. Almost. He takes a mistress around 1514, Bessie Blount. She was one of the Queen's maids of honour, because of course she was. Henry wasn't the sort of bloke to go looking very far. Bessie gives birth to a boy. Henry Fitzroy, they called him. Healthy, loud, perfectly formed, and unequivocally male. Now, a normal person might look at that situation and think, right, so the issue isn't my seed, it's just one of those terrible, unlucky biological mismatches. But Henry didn't process it like that at all. To Henry, the birth of Fitzroy was absolute, undeniable proof of his own perfection. Look, he could make boys. The machinery on his end was in tip-top working order. He even hosted a massive party and eventually made the 5-year-old bastard child the Duke of Richmond, showering the kid with titles and lands, partly because he loved the boy, but mostly, I suspect, because it was a giant public middle finger to Catherine. It was his way of telling the entire court, see, I'm completely blameless in this. The fault lies entirely elsewhere. Catherine had to sit there in silence while her husband openly paraded this illegitimate boy around, lavishing him with honours that should have belonged to a legitimate Tudor prince. It must have been infuriating, absolutely soul-crushing. But if she complained, Henry would get that wounded, tight-lipped look on his face. The look of a man who believes he is being terribly misunderstood and nagged by an ungrateful partner. He was the one suffering, you see. He was the king without a direct heir. The entire kingdom was hanging by a thread because of this situation, or so he told himself late at night, staring up at the carved wooden ceiling of his bedchamber. He started spending less time in her apartments. He stopped sleeping there altogether around 1524, I think it was. He was 33, still in his physical prime, convinced he was a tragic hero trapped in a doomed, barren marriage through no fault of his own. The stage was entirely set. He just needed a religious justification to make the victimhood official, a theological excuse to tear the whole house down and blame someone else for the mess. God was picking on him. That was the only logical conclusion Henry could come to by the mid-1520s, because the alternative, that he was just an ordinary aging bloke whose luck had run dry in the nursery, was completely unthinkable to a man who spent his mornings listening to 4 separate masses before breakfast. He genuinely thought the creator of the universe took a personal, microscopic interest in his marital bed. He was staring down the barrel of a massive dynastic disaster. He had a daughter, yes, little Mary, who was sharp as a tack and loved playing the virginals, but female rulers in England, absolutely not. The last time a woman tried to rule the country, Matilda back in the 12th century, the whole place exploded into 20 years of civil war, bad harvests and general lawlessness where Christ and his saints slept, as the old chroniclers put it. Henry knew his history. He was terrified of the Wars of the Roses starting up all over again the moment his eyes closed for the last time. So Henry starts searching for a reason, a scapegoat, a secret cosmic error that explains why his virtuous life wasn't yielding the desired male result. He didn't look in the mirror. Naturally, he looked in his library. He spent hours hunched over Latin texts, and then he found it. Leviticus, chapter 20, verse 21. A bit of Old Testament law that had been sitting there quietly for centuries, just waiting for a desperate king to misread it. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless. Bingo! It was like a light bulb going off in his head. Self-serving bolt of lightning. It wasn't that Henry was biological misfiring. It wasn't that Catherine was too old. It was that the marriage itself was an abomination in the eyes of the Lord. The Pope back in 1509 had given a special dispensation to let Henry marry Catherine, but Henry now decided that the Pope had no right to overrule God's direct words. The Pope had lied to him. Catherine had tricked him. The whole world had conspired to drag innocent, pious young Henry into an incestuous, cursed union. He was the victim of a global papist blunder. Poor Henry. It boggles my mind how Henry's conscience only kicks in when he fancies something new. His conscience was like a lazy dog that slept in the corner for years, then suddenly jumped up and started barking hysterically whenever a pretty young woman walked past the window, because of course right around the time he's obsessing over Leviticus, Anne Boleyn enters the frame. Now, Anne wasn't like the other court ladies. She wasn't going to just be another Bessie Blount or Mary Boleyn, who, by the way, Henry had already slept with years earlier, which makes his horror over incest with Catherine deeply ironic. Because canon law at the time considered that carnal intercourse with a woman created an affinity that made marriage to her sister invalid without a papal dispensation. But let's not confuse the man with his own logic. Anne said no. She refused to go to his bed unless she had a crown on her head and a ring on her finger. She spent years in the French court. She knew how men operated, and she played Henry like a cheap violin. The rejection drove him completely wild. He wasn't used to hearing no. He was the king. He wrote her these bizarre, aching, deeply needy love letters, sending her dead stags he'd shot himself, asking her to be his only beloved. But in his head, this wasn't just a midlife crisis or a squalid affair with a younger woman. Oh, no, it was a holy crusade. He was trying to set his soul right with God. He was trying to save England from divine wrath. Catherine, predictably, refused to play along with his little internal drama. When Henry went to her in 1527 trying to gently explain, in that patronizing, deeply self-pitying way of his, that they had been living in terrible sin for 18 years and really ought to separate for the good of their souls, she didn't weep or agree. She fought back. She told him to his face that her marriage to his brother Arthur had never been consummated, that she was a true virgin when she married him, and that she was his lawful wife, period. Henry was utterly flabbergasted. How could she be so selfish? Didn't she see how much he was suffering? He actually got angry at her for defending her own virtue and her daughter's legitimacy. In his eyes, Catherine's refusal to quietly pop off to a nunnery so he could remarry was a cruel, unnatural act of malicious stubbornness aimed directly at him. She was ruining his peace of mind. She was delaying God's work. He was the aggrieved party here. He was the king who just wanted to obey Holy Scripture, and this Spanish woman was standing between him and his salvation. He's planning to dump a loyal woman who had stood by him for 2 decades, stripped her of her title, separated her from her daughter, and yet he's the one feeling terribly mistreated by the whole universe. So Henry goes to his right-hand man, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, who had basically been running the entire country. Henry drops this massive, impossible task into Wolsey's lap. Get the Pope to cancel the marriage. Simple, right? Except it wasn't. Not even close. Pope Clement VII was currently trapped in Rome, literally locked inside the Castel Sant'Angelo, because the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who just so happened to be Catherine of Aragon's nephew, had sent an army to sack the city. The emperor's troops were busy looting, burning and terrorizing the locales. There was no way on earth the Pope was going to insult his captor's aunt just to make a red-headed English monarch feel better about his conscience. Clement was terrified. He stalled. He sent legates. He made excuses. He delayed. Henry, sitting over in Greenwich, could not wrap his head around this simple geopolitical reality. He genuinely thought the Pope was just being deliberately difficult. Personal malice. That's what it was. In the summer of 1529, they finally hold a formal court at Blackfriars in London to hear the arguments, while Henry and Catherine were summoned like ordinary litigants. Then came the moment that shattered Henry's carefully constructed drama. Catherine gets up, walks straight past the judges, ignores all the court etiquette, crosses the room and kneels right at Henry's feet. Publicly, in front of every earl, duke and foreign ambassador in the country, she looks up at him and gives this heartbreaking speech, reminding him that she'd been his true wife for 20 years, that she came to his bed as a virgin and asking what wrong she'd ever done him to deserve this humiliation. It was a disaster for Henry, because in his mind she wasn't supposed to fight back like that. She was supposed to politely admit that their marriage was an unholy mistake, weep quietly into a handkerchief, and retreat to a convent so he could move on with his life as the blameless, tragic sovereign. Instead, she made him look like a bully, a villain. He hated her for it, deeply. When Campeggio suspended the court a few weeks later, sending the whole mess back to Rome for a decision that everyone knew would take years, Henry lost his temper completely. He felt cheated again. He'd done everything by the book. He'd hired lawyers. He'd paid off European universities to write papers supporting his Leviticus theory. He'd waited patiently. And now this? He needed someone to pay. He couldn't blame God, obviously. He couldn't blame himself. Wolsey was right there. Poor old Wolsey. He'd worked himself into the ground for 15 years trying to satisfy every bizarre whim of his royal master. But the moment he failed to deliver the Pope's signature on a piece of parchment, Henry turned on him like a feral dog. Henry decided that Wolsey hadn't actually been trying. Wolsey had been secretly sabotaging the divorce. Wolsey was in league with Rome. Wolsey had betrayed his grand, trusting master. He spent late nights with Anne Boleyn and her brother George, talking about how corrupt the clergy were, how unfair the Pope was being, how everyone was taking advantage of Henry's good nature and pious heart. He was starting to view himself as an isolated, persecuted figure, a solitary knight fighting against a corrupt international Catholic conspiracy. He had tried to be a good son of the Church, hadn't he? He'd even written a book against Martin Luther a few years back, the Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, which got him the title Defender of the Faith from the Pope. And now look how Rome treated him in return. Ungrateful. Everyone was ungrateful. Around this time, a quiet, clever man named Thomas Cromwell steps into the shadows, offering a brand new perspective. Cromwell looks at the king and says, essentially, "Your Grace, why are you asking the Pope for permission at all? You're the King of England. You're the boss." This was music to Henry's ears. It wasn't just a political solution. It was a psychological lifesaver. It allowed him to transform his selfish desire for a young mistress into a grand, heroic liberation of the English people from foreign papal tyranny. He wasn't breaking the rules. He was restoring the ancient rights of his crown. He was the victim of a centuries-old papal usurpation, and he was finally standing up for himself. He started signing off on acts of parliament that chopped away at Rome's power bit by bit. He cut off payments to the Pope. He forbade appeals to Rome. He did all this while maintaining an utterly straight face, insisting to foreign ambassadors that he was acting with the purest, most reluctant heart. He didn't want to cause a massive schism in Western Christianity. Goodness no, he was being forced into it by the Pope's obstinacy and Catherine's stubbornness. If only they'd just given him his way in the first place, none of this unpleasantness would be happening. By late 1532, Anne Boleyn was pregnant. The clock was ticking loud and fast. He had to marry her before the baby arrived, or the whole point of getting a legitimate male heir would be completely ruined. So he appointed a new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, a mild-mannered scholar with quiet Protestant sympathies, who promptly set up a court at Dunstable and declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null, void and illegal from the start. Just like that. 18 years of marriage erased with the scratch of a quill. Henry celebrated by throwing a massive, ridiculously expensive coronation for Anne. He rode through the streets of London. He smiled at the crowds. The crowds, it must be said, didn't smile back. They loved Catherine. They thought Anne was a usurper, shouting rude names at her. Some of them didn't even take their hats off. Henry saw this silence, this public hostility, and felt that familiar, hot prickle of indignation again. Why couldn't his subjects see how much he sacrificed for them? Why didn't they appreciate his moral courage? They were being so utterly ungrateful to their hard-working, long-suffering king. So September comes around in 1533, and Anne goes into labour at Greenwich. Henry is practically bouncing off the panelled walls with excitement, already having pre-written letters of announcement sent out to every royal court across Europe proclaiming the birth of a glorious new prince. The astrologers had all promised him a boy. Every single physician, scholar, and starry-eyed mystic he'd paid off told him God was definitely about to deliver the goods. It was a girl, little Elizabeth. You can only imagine the icy, suffocating silence in that delivery room when the midwife handed him the bundle. A red-haired, screaming girl, Henry had literally turned the entire religious, legal and political structure of England completely inside out, severed ties with the Pope, risked a massive invasion from the Holy Roman Empire, alienated his own people, and stripped his first wife of her dignity, all for another daughter. It was an absolute cosmic slap in the face. Instead of seeing the good side of it, or God forbid, considering that nature simply doesn't care about royal titles, Henry sank instantly into a deep, sour, foul mood. He cancelled the celebratory jousts. He refused to attend the grand feast. He treated the whole thing like a malicious joke played on him by Anne, who had promised him sons with absolute confidence during their years of flirting. Anne's position went from untouchable to fragile, almost overnight. She wasn't Catherine. She didn't have a king for a father or an emperor for a nephew to back her up. She was just an English noblewoman who had gotten above her station, and now that the initial passionate thrill had worn off, Henry was starting to realise that she had a bit of a sharp tongue on her. She argued with him in public. She had opinions on politics and religious policy. She wasn't passive or submissive like the ideal Tudor woman was supposed to be. When Henry flirted with other women around court, which he did constantly, because he was Henry, Anne didn't sit quietly in a corner like Catherine had done for 2 decades. She flew into absolute rages. She screamed at him. She demanded he send the other women away. Henry was utterly aghast at this. How dare she? Didn't she realise who he was? In his head, he had made her a queen out of pure, selfless generosity. He had dragged her up from the ranks of the gentry, placed a crown on her head, endured years of stress and international isolation for her sake, and this was how she repaid him, with nagging, with jealousy. He started complaining to his closest companions that he had been seduced into the marriage, that he'd been taken advantage of by a clever, scheming family. Meanwhile, he had to enforce his new title, Supreme Head of the Church of England. Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, making it a treasonous offence to deny that Henry was the big boss of religion in his own realm. This is where the bodies start piling up. Sir Thomas More, his former Lord Chancellor, and once a close friend who used to walk arms linked with Henry, refused to take the oath. So did Bishop John Fisher, a frail old man who was respected all across Europe for his scholarship. Henry didn't want to execute them, not really. He wanted them to bow down, sign the paper, and tell him he was right. He desperately needed their approval, because their approval meant his conscience was clean. When More and Fisher stuck to their convictions and quietly said no, Henry felt personally betrayed. Deeply, deeply hurt. He saw their silence not as a matter of religious principle, but as a direct, aggressive act of malice aimed personally at his royal honour. They were making him look like a tyrant. They were forcing his hand. When Fisher was beheaded in June 1535, followed by More in July, Henry sat in his rooms feeling like the most misunderstood ruler in human history. He convinced himself that they had caused their own deaths through stubbornness, pride, and lack of love for their king. "Look what you made me do," was essentially his entire psychological defense mechanism. He was just the sad, reluctant judge carrying out the law, grieving for the friends who had driven him to it. He even blamed Anne for More's death. There's a story, might be true, might be court gossip, that when the news of More's execution reached him while he was playing cards with Anne, Henry looked at her with pure venom, said, "You are the cause of this man's death," and stormed out of the room to brood in his private closet. It's always someone else's fault with him. Always. Anne was pregnant again. This was her last chance, and she knew it. Then, on January 29th, 1536, the very day Catherine was being buried, Anne miscarried a baby boy, somewhere around 3 or 4 months along, a dead son. When Henry came into her room, cold and furious, she tried to defend herself, claiming the shock of his recent jousting fall. He'd been knocked unconscious for 2 hours a few days earlier, had brought on the miscarriage. But Henry wasn't listening anymore. He was finished. He looked at that dead boy and decided that God was sending him another clear, divine message. God was refusing to bless this union. just as he had refused to bless the union with Catherine. Therefore, logically, this marriage must be just as illegitimate, just as sinful, just as cursed. He hadn't made a mistake in leaving Catherine. Oh no, the mistake was marrying Anne. He had been bewitched, tricked, deceived by a wicked, unnatural woman who had used dark arts and unnatural lust to drag an innocent, godly king away from the path of righteousness. He turned to Thomas Cromwell with a cold, clear directive: "Get me out of this." And Cromwell, who knew his own neck was on the line if he failed, started putting together a legal case that would make Henry look like the ultimate heartbreaking victim of a sinister palace conspiracy. Anne was arrested, charged not just with adultery but with multiple counts of incest, with her own brother George, treason, and plotting to murder the king. The evidence was laughably thin, built on tortured confessions and wild court gossip, but Henry swallowed every single word of it without a second thought. He needed to believe it was true. If Anne was a treasonous monster who had slept with 5 different men behind his back, then Henry wasn't a cruel, murderous husband discarding an unwanted wife. He was a tragic, cuckolded victim, a noble knight who had given his heart to an ungrateful viper. While Anne was sitting in the Tower of London writing him desperately beautiful letters, begging for mercy, Henry was playing music with his new love interest, Jane Seymour, weeping to his companions about how much he had suffered at the hands of that horrible Boleyn woman. When the axe fell on Anne's neck, Henry was already wearing white for his betrothal to Jane the very next morning. A blameless man, finally freed from his tormentor. Henry goes and marries Jane Seymour about 10 days. The ink wasn't even dry on Anne's death warrant before he was standing at the altar with this pale, quiet girl who was basically the exact opposite of the fiery Boleyn woman. Jane was submissive, meek, didn't talk back, and wore those heavy English hoods that covered up her hair entirely, making her look like a very serene, very silent nun who had wandered into the court by accident. Henry was utterly delighted with himself. He convinced his inner circle, and himself above all, that he had finally found his true God-given soulmate, the quiet reward for all his agonizing patience through those dreadful, traumatic years with Anne. In his head, he was the long-suffering martyr who had finally been granted a bit of peace after being horribly abused by a series of manipulative women. It's around this time, late 1536, that the country decides it's had quite enough of his divine revelations. Out in the north, in Lincolnshire and Yorkshire, thousands of commoners, monks, gentry and old-line northern lords band together in what they called the Pilgrimage of Grace. Over 30,000 men marching under a banner showing the 5 wounds of Christ. That was bigger than any army Henry could scrape together in the south at short notice. They weren't trying to overthrow him, mind you. They were medieval peasants. They still believed the king was chosen by God. They just wanted him to stop tearing down their local monasteries, fire his lowborn advisors like Thomas Cromwell, and bring back the traditional Catholic faith. Monasteries weren't just places for monks to pray. They were the local hospitals, the soup kitchens, the places where you got a warm bed if you were travelling through the freezing mud of Yorkshire in November. Henry's reaction to 30,000 of his subjects politely asking him to stop ruining their social safety net. Pure, unadulterated, offended rage. He didn't see people who were starving or deeply worried about their eternal souls after watching their parish churches get stripped of gold and glass. He saw sheer, monstrous ingratitude. He was their loving shepherd. He was the supreme head. How dare these unwashed, illiterate northern bumpkins tell him, a man who spent hours studying complex Latin theology, how to run his church? He wrote them this blistering response, calling them the brutish and bare-bred commonalty of the northern parts, essentially telling them they were far too stupid to understand what was good for them. He couldn't fight them directly right away because, frankly, he lacked the soldiers. So he did what any noble, chivalrous king would do. He lied straight through his teeth. He sent the Duke of Norfolk up north with grand, sugary promises. "Oh, the king hears your grievances. He understands your pain. Lay down your arms, go home to your farms, and the king will hold a parliament in York to address all your concerns and grant a full pardon." The rebels, being simple, trusting folk who genuinely believed a king's word was sacred, wept with joy, cheered for Henry, folded up their banners, and went home to their wives. Then the moment a tiny, localized riot broke out a few months later, giving him the flimsy legal excuse he was desperately searching for, Henry struck with absolute sickening brutality. He tore up the pardons. He sent Norfolk back north with instructions to hang people from trees in every single village, leaving their rotting bodies swinging in the wind as a gentle reminder of royal mercy. Over 200 people were executed. Robert Aske, the lawyer who had led the peaceful protest and trusted Henry's personal word, was dragged to York, hoisted up in iron chains on the castle walls, and left to die slowly of starvation and exposure in the cold wind, while the king sat down in London feeling thoroughly vindicated. Then comes October 1537, and Jane Seymour actually manages to do what no other woman could. She gives birth to a healthy, screaming baby boy, Prince Edward. Henry went wild. He finally had his undisputed heir. He felt like the ultimate hero of an epic tale, a man whose righteous faith had finally been rewarded by the Almighty. 2 weeks later, Jane dies of childbed fever. Septicemia most likely caused by unsanitary medical hands in the birthing chamber, which was a grimly common way for women to die back then regardless of whether they were peasants or queens. Henry was shattered. Truly devastated. He wore black for months, retreated into his rooms. Even in his genuine deep grief for Jane, his internal victim narrative immediately recalibrated itself. Why could he never just have a simple, happy life? Why did God always give him a taste of pure joy, only to snatch it away with tragic, heartbreaking cruelty? He spent the winter sitting by his fireplace, staring at the embers, weeping about his terrible luck, entirely convinced that no man in the history of the world had ever suffered as much as King Henry VIII. His body was starting to break down, his leg was giving him fits, and he was alone again in a massive palace, nursing a broken heart and an ever-expanding waistline. Day in, day out, a searing, throbbing agony radiating up his legs, while he sat trapped in his chair, watching his once glorious body swell into a massive, immobile mountain of flesh. His waistline went from 32 inches to over 54 inches in just a few short years. Trapped in that agonizing, decaying body, his sense of personal victimhood didn't just linger, it went completely nuclear. He couldn't go out and hunt anymore, he couldn't joust, he couldn't show off his fine calves in tight hose. He was stuck inside his own head, surrounded by sycophants who were terrified to tell him the truth about anything. And then there was Anne Boleyn's shadow. He couldn't just leave her as an executed traitor. In his mind, he had to keep justifying why he'd done it over and over again to anyone who would listen. You see how the defense mechanism works now? It's a complete, bulletproof psychological armor. If he executes a wife, it's because she was a witch or an adulterer who betrayed his chivalrous heart. If he executes his oldest friends, it's because they were secretly plotting against his godly leadership. If his legs burn like fire, it's not because his medical team is jamming hot brass pins into his open wounds, but because God is testing his holy patience like Job in the Bible. Because while he was sitting there weeping into his handkerchief about his terrible luck and his painful legs, the scaffolds on Tower Hill were kept thoroughly busy. Anyone who raised an eyebrow at his religious policies, anyone who had a drop of Plantagenet blood in their veins, anyone who dared to remember Catherine of Aragon with a bit of affection, they all got swept up in his net of paranoid self-pity. He destroyed the Courtenay family. He executed the elderly Countess of Salisbury, who was nearly 70 and had to be chased around the scaffold by an inexperienced headsman who hacked at her neck, a bloody awful mess by all accounts, and he did it all while feeling like the injured party. He convinced himself that if he didn't kill them first, they would murder him in his bed. The entire government of England was now being run purely to soothe the fragile, terrified ego of a giant, brain-damaged man with rotting legs who believed the whole world owed him an apology. Then comes Henry's next dilemma in late 1539. Thomas Cromwell looks at his king, looks at the diplomatic situation in Europe, where the Catholic powers are suddenly looking like they might gang up on poor, isolated old England, and decides Henry needs another wife. Fast. Enter the idea of an alliance with the German Protestant princes. And so Anne of Cleves appeared. Cromwell sends Hans Holbein the Younger over to Germany to paint a portrait of her. Now, Holbein was a master, an absolute genius with a brush. But he was also an artist who knew how to make people look, well, let's say flattering. He painted her looking serene, elegant, with beautiful skin and a gorgeous jewelled headdress. Henry took one look at the miniature and fell head over heels in love with a painting, again. By the way, I've made a video covering the full story of Henry and his fourth wife if you'd like to watch it. He was like an impressionable teenager on an online dating app, completely buying into the heavily filtered profile pic. Anne of Cleves was sitting by the window watching a bull-baiting match outside and spoke almost no English. She saw a massive, elderly, smelly man in a dirty cloak burst into her private chamber, trying to kiss her. She barely gave him the time of day. Turned back to look out the window. Henry's ego took a direct, catastrophic hit. He was the victim of a fraudulent marital contract. He'd been sold faulty goods. He actually tried to get out of the wedding the very next morning, begging Cromwell to find a legal loophole. But he couldn't. The diplomatic stakes were too high. The German ambassadors were already in London, and cancelling the wedding on the spot would have risked an immediate war. So he was forced to march down the aisle at Greenwich, looking like he was being led to the scaffold himself, grumbling through his teeth the entire time. The wedding night was an absolute disaster, predictably. Henry went to bed, tried, failed miserably to perform, doubtless due to his health, his obesity, and his sheer wounded pride, and then woke up the next morning to tell his doctors and courtiers all about it. He didn't keep it private. Oh no, he blabbed to anyone who would listen that he had. Left her as good a maid as he found her. He put the entire blame for his own erectile dysfunction squarely on poor Anne's shoulders. It wasn't that Henry was an invalid in his late 40s with rotting legs and a shattered brain. It was that she was so uniquely hideous, she had rendered him completely impotent. Cromwell was in deep, deep trouble now. He had arranged this match. He had promised Henry a beauty, and instead he had delivered a disaster that made the king feel weak, old, and foolish. And Henry hated feeling foolish more than he hated anything else in the world. Right around this time, a young girl appears in the Queen's household, Catherine Howard, lively, tiny, pretty, and completely uneducated. Henry looked at her and saw his fountain of youth. He saw a chance to prove to himself, to his court, and to the entire world that his manhood was still completely intact. Within 6 months, Cromwell was arrested. The man who had built the Tudor state, who had dissolved the monasteries, who had engineered the break with Rome, was stripped of his titles and dragged to the Tower. He didn't give Cromwell a proper trial. He used an act of attainder, a nasty piece of legal shortcutting that meant you could execute someone without letting them defend themselves. On July 28, 1540, Cromwell was beheaded on Tower Hill by a wretched drunk headsman who took several hacked horrific swings to finish the job. On that exact same day, Henry married Catherine Howard. He convinced himself that after all his terrible trials, after the horror of Anne Boleyn, the tragedy of Jane Seymour, and the humiliation of Anne of Cleves, God had finally rewarded him with a pure, innocent angel who would love him for his wonderful, noble self. He'd even paid off Anne of Cleves with a massive estate, just to go away quietly, which she sensibly did. Henry didn't care about the money. He felt he'd bought his freedom from a nightmare. He genuinely thought she adored him. In his mind, his royal majesty was so overwhelming, his charm so legendary, that any woman would naturally fall hopelessly in love with him, regardless of his physical state. He even put out a public call in all the churches of the kingdom, asking his subjects to join him in giving thanks to Almighty God for the grand, peaceful joy he had found in his new marriage. He was practically begging the universe to smack him in the face again. Then, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer gets given a bit of paper. It turns out little Catherine hadn't exactly been a pure, untouched virgin when Henry met her. Not even close. She'd had a full-blown physical affair with a music teacher named Henry Manox, and then an even more serious long-term relationship with a young gentleman named Francis Derham. They'd called each other husband and wife in front of witnesses, which in Tudor law meant they were practically married anyway. And it got worse. Much worse. Even after marrying the king, she'd been sneaking out at night during the royal progress, using her lady-in-waiting, Lady Rochford, to hold secret late-night meetings in closets with a handsome young courtier named Thomas Culpeper. Culpeper was one of Henry's favourite gentlemen of the Privy Chamber. Cranmer was absolutely terrified. He knew what happened to people who brought bad news to Henry. Henry read the note. At first, he literally refused to believe a single word of it. He didn't get angry at Catherine, he got angry at Cranmer. He declared the whole thing was a wicked manufactured lie, a forgery designed by spiteful courtiers who wanted to ruin his beautiful marriage. He ordered a secret investigation, firmly expecting his men to come back, prove the allegations were total nonsense, and then he could have the accusers hanged for slander. Then the reports started coming in, the confessions. Derham talked under torture. Manox gave details. Culpeper admitted they'd met in the dark, whispering about how much they loved each other. When the undeniable, horrific truth finally hit Henry, he didn't fly into a violent, thunderous rage like he usually did. He broke down and wept publicly, in front of his entire Privy Council, wailing about his terrible, wretched luck with women. He cried that God had given him the ill fortune of light women, and complained bitterly that his wives were a curse sent specifically to break his heart. He didn't think for a single second about why a 17-year-old girl might seek comfort in the arms of a young, handsome man her own age, instead of a rotting 50-year-old monarch with an oozing leg ulcer who could barely walk. He couldn't process that reality. In his mind, he had given her everything: crowns, gold, velvet, diamond necklaces. He had elevated her from relative poverty, and she had repaid his pure, chivalrous love by dragging his royal honour through the dirt. She had made him look like an absolute idiot, and for that, she had to die. She was beheaded on the exact same spot where her cousin Anne Boleyn had died 6 years earlier. Henry didn't attend, of course. He was off at a lavish dinner party, trying to drink his sorrows away, surrounding himself with music and young courtiers, forcing everyone around him to act like nothing had happened. But the court diplomats wrote back to their governments that the king looked visibly shattered. He was older, greyer, meaner, and more deeply paranoid than he had ever been in his entire life. He passed a law through Parliament shortly after her death making it treason for an unchaste woman to marry the king without confessing her past first, just to make sure it could never, ever happen to him again. You'd think a bloke who had managed to go through 5 wives with such spectacularly horrific results would take a quiet breath, pick up a hobby like gardening or pottery, and leave the poor women of England alone for 5 minutes. Not Henry. Absolutely not. He decided that what he really needed to cure his profound, crushing self-pity was a nice, bloody, expensive war against the French. Naturally, when your personal life is an utter dumpster fire and your legs smell like rotten meat, what better way to cheer yourself up than spending the entire national treasury to go capture a mediocre French town nobody in London had ever heard of? He convinced himself this wasn't just a bitter old man's vain glory project. In his head, maybe he was reviving the glorious days of Henry V and Agincourt. He was the chivalric warrior king claiming his rightful God-given inheritance across the Channel. The French were being utterly unreasonable by refusing to just hand over their kingdom to him, and the Scots, who had the cheek to raid the northern border while he was preparing his grand crusade, were being ungrateful backstabbers who needed a thorough thrashing. He sent his armies north to smash the Scots at Solway Moss in 1542, where the Scottish King James V, Henry's own nephew mind you, got so overwhelmed by the sheer, brutal disaster of the defeat that he reportedly turned his face to the wall and died a few weeks later, leaving a week-old baby girl named Mary as queen. Did Henry feel a shred of sympathy for his widowed niece or his dead nephew? Don't be daft. He immediately tried to force the Scots to hand over baby Mary, so he could marry her off to his little boy Edward, framing the whole aggressive land grab as a selfless, noble effort to bring peace to the island. When the Scots politely told him to bugger off, Henry flew into another one of his righteous tantrums. He ordered the Earl of Hertford to go burn Edinburgh to the ground, specifically telling him to put man, woman and child to the sword, without mercy, to teach them a lesson about crossing a Tudor king. Look what you made me do, on a massive international scale. While he was orchestrating this terrifying campaign of fire and sword in Scotland, he decided he'd better find someone to nurse him through his golden years. He set his sights on Catherine Parr. Now, Catherine Parr was a sharp, well-educated widow who was actually secretly madly in love with Thomas Seymour. She was planning to marry Thomas. She'd even bought the wedding gear. But when the King of England looks at you with those tiny, piggish eyes and says, "You will be my next queen," you don't say no. Not unless you have a strange desire to see what the inside of the tower looks like from a cell floor. She turned Thomas Seymour away, put her personal feelings in a cold box, and surrendered to her duty. She married Henry. Henry, of course, thought he was doing her the grandest favour imaginable. He was elevating her. He was giving her the highest honour in the land. He convinced himself that she was deeply, desperately in love with him, because how could she not be? He was King Henry. In 1544, he actually crossed the English Channel to lead his army in France personally, sitting on a hill on a giant horse, watching his heavy artillery blast away at the stone walls of Boulogne. He finally took the town after a long, grueling siege that cost England an absolute fortune, basically bankrupting the country and forcing him to debase the coinage, mixing copper into the silver coins so that Henry's nose on the metal would wear down first, earning him the nickname Old Copper Nose among the common folk. When he returned to London, triumphant, waving at the crowd, he couldn't understand why the merchants were complaining about runaway inflation and the collapsing economy. Why were they being so thoroughly miserable? Hadn't he given them a victory? Hadn't he made England feared across Europe again? They were so ungrateful. He had suffered through the mud, the cold, the agony of his legs, all for the glory of the realm, and all these unwashed London shopkeepers could do was whine about the price of bread and the silver content of their pennies. He was executing people on both sides of the exact same religious fence, sometimes on the exact same afternoon. He didn't see himself as a bloodthirsty tyrant who had completely lost the plot. In his head, he was the perfectly balanced, wise, long-suffering father figure, trying to keep his naughty, argumentative children from straying off the straight and narrow path. He was keeping the peace. He was protecting truth. Why couldn't his subjects just listen to him, read his approved English Bible, which he had specifically passed a law forbidding women and lower-class men from reading on their own because they might misinterpret it, and be grateful for his divine guidance? Then Catherine Parr went and made a near-fatal mistake. Catherine was deeply, secretly interested in radical Protestant theology. One evening, while she was sitting by Henry's chair, helping him wrap those nasty bandages on his legs, she brought up a point of scripture. She wanted to debate a theological fine point with him. Henry's face went instantly purple. He didn't see a loving wife engaging in an intellectual chat after dinner. Oh no, he saw a woman having the sheer, unimaginable arrogance to question his supreme theological genius, his authority. He cut her off abruptly, dismissed her from the room, and turned to his conservative Lord Chancellor, Thomas Wriothesley, and Bishop Stephen Gardiner, growling, "A good hearing it is when women become such clerks, and a fine encouragement, to come to be taught by one's wife in my old age." Gardiner and Wriothesley, sensing blood in the water, pounced immediately. They convinced the king that Catherine was a dangerous heretic who was secretly leading a court conspiracy against his royal authority. Henry, nursing his wounded pride, signed an arrest warrant for his own wife. Just like that. Wife number 6 was about to get the Boleyn treatment. I was thinking about this the other day. How completely exhausting it must have been to be one of Henry's wives. You literally couldn't have an opinion on a single verse in the Bible without risking a trip to the tower. It's like living with a partner who threatens to call the police every time you disagree over what to watch on telly. Word of the arrest warrant got leaked to Catherine. Someone dropped a copy of the paper in the hallway, or maybe a friendly courtier slipped it under her door, and she saw her own name written right next to the king's signature. She didn't panic. She didn't fight back. She had seen what happened to Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard when they tried to argue with the king. Instead, she collapsed into a fit of violent, screaming hysterics that the sound echoed down the stone galleries all the way to Henry's bedchamber. Henry, who couldn't stand being reminded of physical distress that wasn't his own, sent his personal physicians to her room to see what was going on. They told him the Queen was literally dying of grief, terrified that she had somehow displeased her beloved, wonderful lord. That was the magic phrase. Displeased her beloved lord. Henry had his servants wheel his big chair down to her room. Catherine threw herself on the floor at his feet, weeping, begging for forgiveness, telling him that if she had ever argued with him about religion, it was only to distract him from the terrible pain in his legs. She claimed she was just a foolish, weak woman trying to learn at the feet of the greatest, wisest theological scholar in human history. Henry's massive ego swelled up like a dry sponge dropped in water. "Is it even so, sweetheart?" he asked, suddenly all smiles and gentle warmth. "Then we are perfect friends again." He was 55. Did he reflect on his life? Did he feel a sudden, late-breaking spike of guilt for the 2 wives he'd decapitated, the thousands of peasants he'd hanged, or his oldest friends whose heads were rotting on spikes over London Bridge? Not a chance. Instead, he turned his dying, paranoid rage on the Howard family. The Earl of Surrey had done something ridiculously silly. He'd had his family coat of arms redesigned to include the royal arms of King Edward the Confessor. To a normal person, that's just a bit of aristocratic snobbery and family pride. To Henry VIII, lying in his bed clutching his rosary beads, it was absolute proof of a grand, treasonous conspiracy. They were going to murder his little boy Edward. They were going to steal the crown. He convinced himself he was acting out of pure, tragic, paternal self-defence. Surrey was arrested and thrown into the Tower. Norfolk was dragged in right behind him. Henry, who was now so weak he couldn't even lift a quill, had a special wooden stamp made so his secretaries could stamp his signature on the death warrants for him. He kept insisting to his doctors that he was getting better. He was going to recover. He was going to ride out again. He genuinely believed God would never let a monarch as godly, as pure, and as thoroughly misunderstood as Henry VIII simply die like an ordinary mortal man. When Cranmer finally gathered the courage to stand by the bed and tell him that his time was up, asking if he wished to receive the last sacraments, Henry reportedly whispered that he would first take a little sleep, and then, "As I feel myself, I will advise upon the matter." He died in the early hours of January 28, 1547. Norfolk's execution, set for that very morning, was cancelled at the last second, because the Privy Council realised they legally couldn't execute a lord when the king who signed the warrant was already dead. He left behind a bankrupt treasury, a deeply divided, religiously traumatised country, a 9-year-old boy king who would die of tuberculosis 6 years later, and a legacy of blood, ruined monasteries and broken lives that would take generations to mend. Yet, if you could have asked him right as his eyes closed for the last time, Henry Tudor would have died utterly convinced that he had been a noble, gentle, long-suffering servant of God who had sacrificed his entire life, his health, and his peace of mind for an ungrateful world that never truly deserved him. His narcissism and persistent desire to play the role of the noble victim led him to disastrous decisions that destroyed both those close to him and his wives. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. Got thoughts or questions? Leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear from you.